from deep down. I give birth from deep down. I give birth from deep down. Oh, so deep down. Labor and delivery in Alaska, done hospice work, has written a book on massage, has a film called Mother Touch. And over the years, we've been in and out of conversations around the more subtle, invisible aspects of what occurs in a woman's psyche, in her soul, what happens in the relationship of how a woman is transformed in a laboring and birthing postpartum journey. And what it looks like, feels like, what happens when there is not an intact experience, when the experience of labor, delivery, and postpartum does not come to a completion. And we were way too busy for many decades to actually create anything, because we were both actively involved in birth and in dying. And so we started getting more serious about creating this framework. And the framework that we're going to talk about today is birth as a rite of passage. And to drop into a deeper understanding of that, although we can't do it all. And so part of what we're creating is actually a training, a workshop for what we're calling birth integration specialists. So it's kind of like your Doula Plus situation, where the tools are deeper, and there's a refined sophistication. We're going to get into that. There's one myth of humanness. It's called the Monomyth. And if you study the work of Joseph Campbell and other people who do cross-cultural research and study, all of the mythologies that different cultures contribute is actually one myth with many components. And if you haven't had a chance to look at these charts, you're welcome to crawl up and do that, take pictures of it. It is a myth of moving from what is known into the unknown. And that journey, with its many components, is apropos to labor, a birth, and a postpartum. And that's the synthesis we're going to begin to articulate today.
So we wanted to start with just asking you what you think about a rite of passage. If there's ways you've encountered that. We've all been through some kind of rite of passage in our life to this stage right now. So just want to elicit from you, when you think of rite of passage, what kind of things do you think of? Or don't tell us a whole story right now, but just an invitation right now to say, what is a rite of passage? What's an example of one that you're familiar with?
Possibly moving through an experience where you're transformed or reborn anew after this experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or having an experience that seems like an initiation into another level of your life, another level of depth in your life.
Courage.
What else? Any other thoughts or a story in your own life, an example of a time of life that you might go through, or that people you know have gone through, that you would consider a rite of passage?
Well, I was just thinking, I was just talking with my granddaughter yesterday, who was 17, and started moving. She's got one more year of high school, and we were talking about that a little bit, and what's coming next, and she's a little frightened.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a big piece, and she's got a year to plan for this, but it's like, okay, 17.
So moving from the known, her known world into
Right.
the unknown.
And totally.
And so graduation
Yes.
is a modern rite of passage.
And it's a rite of passage not just for the child who's leaving home, but for the parents who are left.
And the grandparents.
And
And the grandparents.
and the grandparents, everybody. And that's an important part of a rite of passage, is that it's not just the person who's going through that transformation, but it's a community generally who are affected by one person's journey and who help to support and nurture that journey for that person. And that's a critical piece in any rite of passage, that there's a web, a network of connection to help us. We can't live without that. We like to think we're all independent individuals in our kind of society, but in reality, we need each other. And when we come to the challenges of our lives, it's that times when we really need to rely on someone else to help us, on our community, on our web. And that as doulas, you are critical pieces in the birthing story, in the birthing rite of passage. You're part of that community and that web.
I was going to say, when you go through a rite of passage, there's a welcoming, hopefully, welcoming you into a new tribe or a different part of the tribe, and you're recognized and held
Yes.
in your tribe or community in a different way or different level or depth. And possibly letting go of the old way that you were related with and held and seen.
That you can't even anticipate really until you get there, what you have to let go of something.
Yeah.
So we wanted to just go through more specifically what some of the steps are, and you've named it already, that it's a journey of transformation. It's a time of initiation. In all the mythologies, there's in our favorite adventure stories, there's always a hero or a heroine who faces great challenges and comes back to their people transformed in some way, or offering gifts or stepping into a new role. So I like to think of the chrysalis in birth and that process of going from one state into a chrysalis state where you're neither here nor there. The caterpillar becomes liquid. It metamorphosizes from a solid matter into a liquid matter and transforms into a butterfly. And you can't force that process. There's certain factors that help that to happen. And then to really become the butterfly, it has to emerge itself out of that chrysalis state. And that's what happens on any rite of passage.
And those liquid cells are called imaginal.
Yes, imaginal cells. Yes.
Somebody
Thank you.
came up with that. That's wonderful. So the imagining of what you can be, what you can become. In general, in any rite of passage, there's 3 primary phases. The first is the preparation, and the preparation and the severance from what was. And that's really important. And we know we have childbirth ed classes, but usually that's a preparation for birth, like how do you breathe, how do you relax, what's going to happen. But it's not always a preparation on the deep spiritual level of you're about to go through this very intensive transformation to become a mother to this child. And what's that going to mean, and what are you letting go of in order to do that? You're maybe letting go of being the maiden who hasn't been the mother, or you're letting go of being the mother to just one child. That child also has to let go. There's death that's involved in this journey. Once you step across the threshold into that liminal chrysalis state, that's its own stage where there's altered mind. You're not in your regular state of mind anymore. And everything that comes to you is potent, even more than it is in our regular life, because you're in that altered state. Everything is a message. Everything is bringing a gift, even in the greatest challenges. And there's always challenge you have to face in order to be transformed. And then the most important, we think of oftentimes the labor and birth being the most important time, but really it's how do you come back from giving birth, from retrieving that child bringing it into the world. And now how do you come back into the world as a new person? And who's there, as you said, who's there to welcome you and receive you and recognize that you've been changed? That reincorporation time is the most critical time. Because if that doesn't happen properly, if it doesn't happen to completion, someone is left hanging in the in-between world. Or they're trying to be who they were before. And you're not. Are you who you were before? No, and you're being formed still. You're becoming a mother to this new beautiful baby. And that's its own process and its own passage. So those are the 3 stages. And in the end of any rite of passage, hopefully what happens is that you are recognized and help to integrate your new skills, your new awareness, and new sense of self, so that you can function as a mother. Now you're received into that role.
And I just wanted to say, every time Leslie would send me emails and things with ROP, I'm thinking, right, occipital posterior. And after, oh, rite of passage.
A midwife, only a
What's, and I'm like, I was talking
Vital ingredients and...
Yeah, what's this ROP thing?
Yeah. So we talked about these things. There's vital ingredients to going through this, and a lot of that is how you prepare, what you meet, who you meet along the way, and how you integrate that, how you're welcomed back into your community.
And I want to say that never before in human, right, 200,000 years of mammalian biology, being human, giving birth, that has a human culture imposed a fractionation where the assignment of being an individual is exalted. In 200,000 years of being human, this has never happened. And I liken it to smearing Vaseline on glasses. As conscious as you think you are, we are all imprinted with this unconscious imperative that says rugged individualism is to be exalted and connection is to be eschewed. So the forces that, the more we become conscious, the more we understand the framework of what we're talking about, the more that becomes embodied inside of you, the deeper you'll be able to hold this framework of this container for the people you're guiding. This idea of being an individual, and you have to have self-reliance, has effect in our souls and with each other. So I wanted to highlight that because, this process of understanding the operating system of this earth realm is what we're talking about. The operating system has known and unknown. Thousands of generations of human beings have studied this, and this is the reduced module. This is the refined wisdom. There's known, there's unknown, and there's stages. And if you do not complete the stages, that incompleteness has effect for self, other, community, baby. Okay,
So we talked about these elements. So in the birth process itself, that preparation stage, that first stage, just so I know, are most of you, you're in training to be doulas, or who's actually working doula out there? Everybody? And who's a postpartum doula? Raise your hands a little higher just so I can see who's really out there. And are you a birth doula?
In training.
You're in training? Okay, great. So, your role as a birth professional in the pregnancy stage, you have the potential to help a woman to enter into a deeper awareness of what's going on, more than just, I'm so excited I'm pregnant. There's a process that through working with the model of Rite of Passage, you can ask perhaps more appropriate questions or more leading questions to help her get to some core places. One of the things I have spent starting in my 20s, I started guiding people onto wilderness rites of passage. So we would go out for a week at a time or 10 days. And people would go out to do solo quest time, fasting, and on a rite of passage that was self-imposed as opposed to birthing, that's a natural rite of passage. One of the things that was really important in the preparation was looking at what are your fears about going out. Naming the fears that you know are there or that are lying deep subconsciously or subliminally. Because if we don't address those fears, they definitely come up during the birth process. Naming those fears and finding what are your sources of strength. What do you know already are ways that help you to navigate difficult times. Identifying those are really, really important in that preparation time, because you as a doula are going to want to know what they are. Because if a mother is out there in that liminal space and starts to have a freak out, which is very possible, you already have identified some of the things that help her to come back into herself again. And you want to know that, and she wants to know that. If you've talked about it ahead of time, she will remember too when you said, oh, right, I remember that place. There are things that you can cultivate that way also. You would say.
Is it story time yet? Just cue me.
Yes, go right ahead. Story time.
So, because this preparation, it's a circle. You cannot apply a straight line to a circle. You just can't. We do it all the time in this culture, right? We try to flatten circles. We try to flatten and annihilate spirals of light. Good luck with that. It's not going to happen. So the identification of fears is a necessary part, but it doesn't always happen in the communication during prenatals. Sometimes it's during labor. Sometimes it's during the intensity, where the woman is balanced between, she's on the horizon and about to go into the underworld. So a woman was in labor for a day and a half, and labor would stop and start and stop and start and stop and start. And I was getting exhausted. Leslie and I were both at this labor. We were calling in allies, which is also an integral part of understanding the rite of passage. And the web, you can't do it alone. It's not happening, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, it's New England, it's a dark night in the woods, there's a beautiful clear moon. And this is not the first time I had asked her this question, what is your deepest fear? But she also knew that if we didn't kickstart this labor, that probably by dawn we would transport. And so we're walking down a dirt road, and she still couldn't go there. So in silence, we walked, and she knew it's 2 o'clock in the morning. By 6, 7 a.m. we're going to the hospital. And that wasn't a threat. It's understanding the boundary. And she finally said, well, I'm afraid I'm going to bleed to death. I'm afraid there's something wrong with my placenta. I'm afraid I'm not going to bond with the baby. And in that moment, it was, I pulled out my tool bag, the system of inquiry, the work of Byron Katie, looking into each one of those fears. And it was arduous, step by step. I mean, this woman was in anguish because she didn't want to look. That she had been terrified all of her life since she was a child. Now she's telling me she had been dreaming that she was going to bleed to death. So we're walking, and I asked her, so what are you getting out of holding on to that story? And she burst into tears and started weeping and weeping. And she just said, I'm so afraid. I'm going to die. And I said, yeah, you are. You are. But it doesn't have to be physical. So can you rotate, transform, and enter into that death state you are going to die, and not be so attached to the terror of the physical death, because that's what she was convinced about. And there was resistance, like this was a long road we're walking. Resistance, resistance, resistance. And I said, all I'm asking you is, are you willing? Are you willing to die? Not physically. And she said, yes, but I don't know how. You're not being asked if you know how. That's not the question. But that's often the confusion that we hold in our subconscious, is that we're responsible and we're supposed to know how, and it gets all tangled up. And part of here, allies come to help you untie that knot. And so when she was sobbing, saying, I'm willing, but I don't know how. And we're saying, you don't have to know how. But fear is a form of danger and violence. Fear can kill you if it's held in and not somehow the pressure of that, the internal pressure of fear, is not very gently and skillfully released and redirected. So, as we got to the end of the crossroads, what Leslie did is that she literally dug a line in the dirt. And we stopped, and Leslie said, well, we don't know. You're at the threshold. You don't know how, but we're here. We're here to hold you. And so she stood at this line drawn, literally in the dirt, and her husband was there with us as well, and it was an invitation to symbolically step over the threshold into the unknown. So what we did is we, in the moment, created this rite of passage, so to speak. She stepped over it, and we formed a circle, and we started sounding, and she kicked into labor. That's one of the ways, when you can deeply embody the framework and container of a rite of passage, of how it's not going to work as a straight line. I didn't get any of this information in prenatals. It's in the intensity of labor sometimes.
Yeah, and I love the way you're showing it here. Because that's what happens. The baby gets stuck in a certain position. There's tension in the belly. There's holding. There's resistance in that fear. And so when we can address, when we can come to meet that place. And the many rites of, the many tools along the way in a rite of passage. Every step you're going further in to that liminal state. So she had crossed many thresholds up to that point, drinking lots of castor oil or other things. Here was another one, and just the power of drawing a line in the sand and stepping over it. This is, in many cultures, doorways are used as the idea of stepping into another dimension, in a sense. So you can make that along the way as you start to incorporate the idea of what are ceremonies and rituals, simple things like that, that can help to alter someone's mind.
And the group did not know. Like hearing her fear, I always listen when a woman, shares her intuition and her fears. I could not tell her that she was not going to die from a hemorrhage. All we could do is say, we're holding you in the unknown. And that level of holding expanded into the group, and everything remained intact. She went on to have a surprise twin delivery. Pardon me? Oh, I'm sorry.
But another really beautiful part of this is that place of being with what is instead of trying to make it be something else. And an example of that is a friend who was in labor, and her father and her brother both had died right before she got pregnant, both separate from each other. So she had a lot of grief while she was gestating this baby, and she ended up choosing a midwife that she had no good relationship with, so she didn't have a safety net with her, a sense of trust with her, but she was with her anyway. That was part of her journey. And when she brought up this grief inside, the midwife said, "But just think of pink bubbles floating away with those stories so that you just feel wonderful." She couldn't face the fact that she had a client who was carrying grief like a big burden in her heart while she was pregnant, and the midwife couldn't face that. So that didn't serve her. Jalen was not happy about that. It didn't work for her. That wasn't the way. What Terry's saying is, the reality is, yes, some part of you is going to die. Yes, you are carrying this horrendous grief along with you. And now what? So what do we do with that now? And in order to be able to do that, you have to have met that in yourself. And this particular midwife wasn't able to assimilate grief in herself or someone else's grief. So part of the journey of being a guide on the way is that you keep meeting your own fears, your own obstacles, and noticing how you get through, so you know what it's like that you can go through and come out on the other side. During that in-between state, as we said, we're in another world, in another dimension. How many people have given birth here or been through that process? Do you have children?
No, I don't.
During that time, the way, as you know, you've learned about this or are learning about this, the way you meet someone is critical. How you approach it, what you say, how you enter in with such reverence into that altered state, because you're on the journey with her. We all get altered. We all go into another dimension when we're going with someone through labor, right? We're not quite in the same place as her, though. We are the guides, we're the rooting cords. And I wanted to say with this woman in Massachusetts, the progress was still slow, and there was still concern that she would go to the hospital. And so there was a point where I went with her and her husband into the very hot humid bedroom.
And I needed to take a nap, because I was at my wit's end.
And you were thinking
like
about
48 hours.
Yeah, so there was a little window. It's an old 1700s farmhouse, no air circulation, a little fan going, you're all up there breathing and being hot.
Right at dawn.
Right at dawn, and I said to her, we have got to shift things. Now is the time. Now again, another threshold. So I want both of you to call on the forces, call on the spirits, call on whatever you believe in that's bigger than you. Call on that right now, because we need that help. And we were friends, so she was very comfortable with me, and I was being a massage therapist for her. So I got out the oils and slathered her up, her belly and her legs and her inner thighs, and started massaging. And working with just feeling energy moving. And a chant came in from somewhere that I started to sing. And her husband had fallen to the ground and was praying, and she was doing something inside of herself. And we started massaging and breathing and relaxing. And all of a sudden, a wind came through the window, very noticeably, and it circled around us in the room. And it was so beautiful because we were so hot up there, and it was this fresh air, this fresh energy came in. And we noticed it. And the next thing we knew, she said, something feels different with this contraction. I feel pressure. Excited. We kept doing what we were doing, and the next contraction, she was like, oh! And I'm like, oh, that's And pretty soon she was saying, I have got to push. And I ran downstairs to get Terri, and indeed, she was fully dilated. And she said later that, and then she pushed out her surprise babies. But she said that time was so critical to her. She could relax because she trusted her environment. She trusted me, she trusted her husband, she trusted Terri. And we called on something greater that came in a physical form in that wind. That air shifted, something shifted. The power of our using our mind and our hearts to call on something to change cannot be underestimated, at that time. And I'm not one to say how to do that. I didn't know what was going to happen. But it was an invitation to them to call on something. And between the three of us, something happened. So again, the web, the network of support to make that happen.
I want to talk a little bit about the liminal space. So this is the altered space that happens in situations like birth or some kind of rite of passage where traditionally you're brought to an extreme. Right? Our culture will use drugs to access liminal states. Everybody likes to get high, right? Everybody loves to get stoned. Why? Because human beings have a natural tendency to seek a liminal state, because a liminal state provides insight. It provides an expanded view of things. But remember, we're located in a culture that has fractionated into individualism. So we don't have an understanding that those liminal states are, one could say, a sacred place. And so here we are at birth, and that liminal state is anesthetized. So the use of drugs where, no, you're not supposed to feel pain. You're not supposed to face the unknown. And it's just a little bit of a cultural, again, context to understand what are we doing when we are moving from the known world to the unknown. It's a life-death, life-death, life-death pulse. The preciousness of life, the imminence of death is with us always. Birth is no exception. It magnifies the pulse, that's all it does. Welcome.
So I'm just curious right now if there's anything stirring for there. What do you think of? What's been your experience so far with anything we're talking about through the birth process? Any comments or thoughts or questions?
I was thinking about the story I was talking about this morning. One of my sisters delivered her daughter at home, and it was a really long labor, and she'd been working really hard, and there was a point where I walked in the room and I hadn't been there for several hours, and the way that I saw her looked like death. Mm-hmm. She had these beautiful long dreadlocks at the time, and they were just fanned out around her head, and she was exhausted to the bone. She had an oxygen mask on her face, and I thought, something has got to shift. She has to have this baby soon, or she's gonna die, I just had never seen that face on her or felt that energy. And she had her baby soon after, and she was in my shower rinsing off after, not soon after, a little bit after, and I just remember how she had shifted 180. Just the way I saw her when I walked in that room to the way I was supporting her as she rinsed off in the shower was completely different. So
Yes.
She was reborn.
Beautiful. Because that life-death, life-death, life-death pulse is what you saw, what she contacted. We have this straight line idea, oh, death, straight line, stop. No, it's a pulse. And if you touch it in that way, life is there, because that's the next beat in the pulse. Oh, beautiful, beautiful story. Thank you.
Part of the reincorporation then with that as a great story is that woman went through that and touched death in herself, and may not even realize that afterwards when she comes out with her baby and now is all focused on the baby. Somewhere along the journey afterwards, it will start to rise up again for her. What happened? Where was I? What was that experience? Or I was riding the edge of death. And how did I know that? That never occurred to me. I was having a baby. I didn't know I'd be close to death. And part of the reincorporation time then is helping to integrate, helping to digest some of that. It might not happen right away. It might not be during the time you're actually seeing her, but it's important to be aware of that need, that at some point that may come up again, and it may be that it needs to be talked about soon during the time that you're visiting, or there may need to be an invitation to tell her birth story at some time, to come to terms with that.
Yeah. Well, you were sparking a memory of assisting with the birth, and when you're talking about the reincorporation, I recognize that happens often on throughout a birth also, that us as for those of us who are assisting a birth, it's like helping them then moving back for the family to reincorporate again, for her to reincorporate. So I'm thinking of this birth where I went, and they were called in a panic if the labor doesn't start within a few hours, they would need to be transferred to the hospital. And I just had a cancellation. They were 5 minutes away. I was able to get in the car and get there. And I walk in and I hear the fear and I hear the story and I feel the room and it's like, and I entered it. And I was there like, whoa. And then I was like, that is not my job. My job is not to enter that zone. My job is love.
Yeah.
And so I called on love, and I dropped into love, and I dropped into my heart, and I just started beaming that love into the woman's brain with all my being. And she had already tried castor oil 5 times that day and had acupuncture a few times. And in the beaming the love, all of a sudden she said, I need to go to the bathroom. And she went to the bathroom and the labor had started. And I walked out, and then 20 minutes later, she was calling Terri. And when I walked out the door, the grandmother said, this transformed. And then the sparkles were in the room.
Yes.
So it was like that coming in, but then my job was done. And they were in the reincorporation. And I asked, would you like me to stay? She said, no, I'm okay now. No, I'm not that she, it's just, she had the confidence, it was there. So to see that reincorporation right in the birth, it's not just the presenting out into the community, but then it was for you to be able to bow. My work is done.
Beautiful.
It's that in and out of the confidence that this person can do it.
Yes.
You were the wind.
I was the wind.
Yes.
I was the wind.
That changed it. And the word I study love etymology. Reincorporation. Re means again in Latin. In the body. Again, go in the body. So that's what reincorporation is. Because liminal states are so expanded, we go out of our body, our consciousness. Right? We talk about disassociation. So that's the pathological aspect. You can't get back in your body. It doesn't have to go to that extreme. But every liminal experience has to have a reincorporation.
And there was the body of his family. His father was actually very, very close. And she told me that. I knew her. He didn't want others in easily. And he called me, invited me in, so the window was open. And I was touched deeply that he was inviting me in. But I could feel then, okay, I honor now that window closed, and they are intact. They're their intact family. And so I really wanted to honor that opening and closing. And that I see often with the family unit is there, however their roles are, either they're really social or really private, and then to quickly honor that.
Yes. Beautiful example where, first of all, again, it's not a linear process, and we cannot apply mechanical tools or responses to an immaterial obstacle or challenge. Right? If she had 5 castor oil doses and
Maybe it was 3.
acupuncture,
I don't know.
whatever. Okay, so, but what our culture does is that we reduce to a kind of scientific materialism and say, this is reality, there's nothing outside of that. It's part of the ignorance that has been impelled by this individualism. You cannot apply mechanical tools to an immaterial challenge or an obstacle. And in that moment, having that energy, that it's what's going to antidote fear? Love. But it has to be deep, steady, and grounding. Because it's not just, putting a post-it note on a landmine, okay? If somebody is terrified, do not put frosting on that landmine. Oh, just visualize pink bubbles and everything will be okay. Right? You gotta meet the velocity. Right? And that's what doulas, midwives, people who understand the container of a rite of passage can do. And Kim walked in and met the velocity.
I became it for a moment and recognized that this vibration is not what I came for.
And I noticed that the slide before this was hospital births. And again, the rite of passage, this is part of, it is inextricably woven in the human journey on earth. It don't matter if you're in the hospital, you're still undergoing the rite of passage. And part of what we have to do is dissolve and understanding that something's wrong because you're in a hospital. That could be that mother and child's obstacle as they go into the underworld.
I'm sure you've heard this before. This was from Margaret Mead. In any society, how a woman gives birth and the kind of care given to her points as sharply as an arrowhead to the key values in the culture.
Would you read that again? I don't have my glasses on.
In any society, how a woman gives birth and the kind of care given to her points as sharply as an arrowhead to the key values in the culture.
Could you read that again?
Yeah. And whose quote is that? Feel free to get a stool or something over there if you like.
This is from Women as Mothers, How They See Themselves in Different Cultures by Sheila Kitzinger, but I am pretty sure that quote is in that book from Margaret Mead, who was an anthropologist who studied birth in many cultures long ago. In any society, how a woman gives birth and the kind of care given to her points as sharply as an arrowhead to the key values in the culture. So if we look at the way we as a society tend to treat birth and look at what you're bringing to offer. There's a movement afoot. 20 years ago, nobody knew what the heck a doula was. Now, it's around the country. Even maybe in Kansas, I don't know if they have doulas there. It's definitely on the coast, in the country.
Is that amoebic cell wall?
But, to watch, Barbara, I don't know how long have you been training people here?
Since 09.
Okay.
But, and then a while ago I was doing something too.
Something like that, yeah. So I think it's important to know, we are the little seeds going out to start to change a consciousness, and we're just on the edges of it. But every person that you interact with, every person you bring a deeper sense of, a deeper quality of presence, you're impacting the birth of that child. You're impacting how that child experiences its first glimpse of the world, its first breath, its first meeting with its family on the outside world.
And there's notches that get made in a midwife's heart, and probably a doula's heart as well. And so I therefore would rely on birth support, on doulas, on other healthcare professionals to help do that. Because this, the integration in that time to keep the wholeness intact is not just a 6-week postpartum event. It can take years. It can take decades. You know, I've spoken to women in their 60s and 70s where their birth was the most crucial moment in their life, and they still had not yet been able to fully gain completion. So that's, again, understanding that it's not linear, but it's so necessary. So as we understand the process, this container, we may not always be the ones, but we can keep extending an awareness and a confidence that there's a necessary integration. And this is also when you need to call in allies and support.
I'm thinking again of how contagious certain fields are, that the love field is contagious, that it has impact. And so that our coming in and seeing the preciousness of the child helps open the hearts of everybody around, can help start creating a pathway. That what we're holding potentially can spark that holding in another too. And we do that together. That's the web that we're...
Thank you. There's also this rite of passage for the doula itself, that, or the midwife too, which is in an intense birth, you need to have a reincorporation. Whether that's talking with another doula or talking with an elder, or if a birth is traumatic. So there are overlapping circles and spirals of this rite of passage. It was integral that nobody told me this as a young midwife, that I was going to need that. I had to figure this out and seek out that support.
I wanted to also say it's so important, as I'm sure you know, that doulas don't have to just fit into the world of people who live like you or want a rite of passage. You know, that there's an important skill in how do you meet someone where they're at and use the language that they're comfortable with, because your job is to support them to birth this baby. And not everyone is going to relate to this language. Not everyone's going to think that's important. And so the real guide as a doula is, how do you sense what's they're wanting? Even, they may want an epidural. How do you support that? They might need an epidural. They didn't want it before. But how do you navigate a system that might be in a hospital, might be in home, and serve their need with the rite of passage in mind? Because they're going through it, whether they want to face it or not. But it has to adapt and change what makes sense and find the little pieces that they relate to. It's not about how you relate to it, but how do you
For their experience.
Yeah. And there's not everyone would even relate to this, but in any situation, a lot of times just this is the sacred moment. Just this,
It's okay.
That is a powerful tool, just giving your presence. And there's actually been studies on that, looking at a nurse coming into a room of someone in labor and just putting her hand on the woman's shoulder, her blood pressure goes down. Simple measure, but probably, for some women, the most potent thing they could experience. I was in Uganda in birthing in a clinic where they have babies and other things. Very challenging, uncomfortable situation. 2 exam tables frozen, rusted into some position or other, not adjustable. The women had to come with a garbage bag, plastic bag to lie on. That was their sheet. They had to bring their own. And their own cotton balls and all. And no one could come into that room, which was maybe the size of from here, maybe smaller than this little corner here. 2 women at a time, laboring often. And I would stand, if I was there, stand between them. Literally, here's one and the other was here, and she'd be having a contraction, and I'd massage her, and then, oh, sister, help me. And I'd massage her, oh, sister, massage her. And, and then every once in a while, if it was going on, I'd have to leave, take a little break, and they had never gotten that kind of attention, because that was not what they were getting from the clinic people who were yelling at them or slapping them or whatever. Just that helped so much for them to pass through this journey, and will be with them forever. And that's an important part of knowing as a doula. You are indwelled in their birth forever as a guide along the way, and support along the way. You may have 150 or 500 or 1,000 births, and you might not remember them specifically sometimes. But you are in their story for the rest of their life, and their child's story too. So recognizing in this process of looking at Rite of Passage, you are a guide. You are an important element. One of the critical tools on this journey is there's someone you rely on, whether that's the mate or a doula or a midwife or a spirit or whatever it may be. That's an important position to be in. Where are we? Oh, so why is understanding birth as a rite of passage important? One of the things I think that's integral to what we're looking at and wanting to cultivate is there is more and more recognition of birth as a potentially traumatic experience for women. Part of that trauma may come because they weren't able to integrate the process afterwards, so maybe afterwards is a traumatic time. Part of it may be because they were in a setting where they didn't feel supported, or they didn't understand what was going on, or their wishes were not recognized or acknowledged or allowed.
Or previous trauma getting reactivated during the birth experience.
So our hope is that as doulas or birth professionals would become more skilled in tools to help navigate the journey, to help with an adequate preparation and an adequate integration afterwards, that we could help to decrease some of the trauma that happens, the potential for trauma, and help to bring people back into their core after something that seemed traumatic. So there is an epidemic of that kind of experience for women, and we need to find the ways to help minimize it and heal from it as well. So that's one of the reasons why we're looking at this also. What else are we supposed to do?
What's a doula to do?
Do you want to say something?
No, because I don't have my glasses on. I can't read the PowerPoint. I'm a plug-in. I just go on and I'll jump in and say something.
Yeah, well, I think we've said a lot of these things. What's a doula to do is, one, to really understand what it means to be on a rite of passage. And that means having to look at your own life. What have been your rites of passage, and what's helped you to find grounding in that process? What's helped you to face the big obstacles that show up? Rite of passage comes in many forms in our lives. As a big health crisis often is a rite of passage trying to get through that. Or
And again, we have a cultural overlay that says avoidance, denial, and oblivion as cure are acceptable responses. So you go into oblivion, with drugs or alcohol, or you go into denial. That the pain of this transformation, this is the operating system of the earth realm. And so to apply avoidance, denial, or oblivion as cure is rather spiritually immature. And so as doulas, as people who protect and defend and companion people in birth as a rite of passage, with the tools and skills, one of the points I wanted to make is that when you journey into the underworld with another person, part of the necessity is to be able to extract yourself from their underworld. And that can also take time, skill, support, insight. So you're not stuck in someone else's journey. So that you can be fully present to someone else. And so part of that doing as a doula is to understand all of this.
And to really live it, to embody it, to recognize your role and what it means so you can see it in all the different forms. It's difficult when you are with someone who's having a hospital birth. So I have a story of a friend who wanted a birth center birth, couldn't afford it, insurance would pay for this high-risk hospital in Portland. So she had to navigate the system and try to make it the kind of birth she wanted. Along the way, before we went to the hospital, we acknowledged it was going to be a different environment. So what can we bring to make it feel more homey? What are we going to do when we get there and this happens, and this intrusion happens, and this suggestion for the epidural happens? How are we going to navigate that? And now we're setting off there, so let's mark that. We literally did stepping over thresholds, because that's an easy way. Or we went through the doorway of before we walked through the hospital, we stopped and said, okay, here we go. Now we're going to step through that doorway. And let's bring everything we've talked about to this point with us. And then we got in there and she didn't have a room available yet. And then, so they had to hang out in a little waiting room while she's in labor. And then finally she gets to her room. She has a nurse who's constantly coming in and saying, well, your water's been broken for this many hours, but I know you don't want to, I know you don't want to get any interventions, but, if you don't do something soon, the baby could get an infection, and then both of you will need antibiotics, and then you'll be separated, and I know you don't want that, but, it's okay if you just want to stay late, it's really nice, So it was like that constantly, this constant interference. And so it was difficult. It was hard for me, okay? This is my dear friend's daughter, she's a wonderful person in my life. I know what's going on. She doesn't necessarily see that this is happening. I see the undermining constantly. I was struggling. How do I keep making awareness of this as a rite of passage, Terri, how do I look at this? Help. There's ways to, there's challenges when you get into that environment.
And I don't know, has anybody read the book by Robbie Davis Floyd, Birth as an American Rite of Passage?
I have it in the library.
Yeah. Because, all right, what we're talking about is that the operating system of the earth realm is a rite of passage. You have to go from known to unknown, whether it's through birth, sickness, or death. We will go there. And since this is the operating system, what our culture has done is that we have created birth in a hospital. It has reenacted these rites of passage. And an anthropologist in the 90s wrote a beautiful book called Birth as an American Rite of Passage and breaks it down. So that, but it's completely unconscious. Like the hospital CEO does not know that they're participating in rites of passage. Not necessarily the OBs and the LMT nurses know that, but every step of the way in a hospital birth is a rite of passage. Because you have things that are ceremonial and ritualistic. Everyone takes off their clothes and puts on the gown because you have entered the temple of the hospital. Right? There are rituals of placing IVs. These are, if you step outside and look at the framework of what a hospital birth is, they are enacting rituals. And so to have that awareness, there's nothing wrong, but you got to learn to work with it. And it's intimidating when there's a, gestalt of a hospital.
And a gestalt of saying, I am the hospital, the doctor, the authority, not you, as opposed to being on a natural rite of passage where you are the initiate, you are the heroine,
Right.
you are the one making decision. You have to face what comes your way, though, whereas here it's more stripping that away, or attempting to oftentimes just take that away. So how do you hold that sacred place within that to keep finding what's your initiative right now in this situation?
Because in a liminal space, everything that appears is either a monster or an ally. And your job as the initiate is to transform the monsters into allies. And to be able to receive the allies appropriately. And so what we have done is that we have created this hospital ritual that often just stays as the monster. And so that's kind of a sub-spiral within what we're talking about. When you get a chance to do a longer kind of workshopping and training, we can go more deeply. But there's profundity when we take this model and kind of zoom in on what are we really looking at here.
We just want to do a little ceremony, a circle, but we want you to be aware of this. Our thought today was to introduce this idea because we think there's a need to help birth professionals like yourselves to start thinking this way and to have tools, to learn skills and tools that can help you to support women and families on this journey in a rite of passage way, without it being, step one, when you first meet your client, you should smudge her. That's not what we're teaching. But we do want to offer some skills for navigating difficult situations, ways of mirroring and asking questions. What are the kind of questions that are useful in this process, in preparation and in reincorporation, and when you're in the liminal state? And also, because the reality is for postpartum doulas especially, oftentimes you walk in, you may not have been there for the birth, you might be walking in after a whole traumatic event, and what are you going to do then? And that's a really important time that I don't know really gets addressed in the postpartum, some of the postpartum trainings. So that's what we're looking at offering in some more extensive way, as well as helping you have an experience, if you choose, of a rite of passage that might be through a wilderness experience, doing your own wilderness quest, which would be a requirement, but something that would be offered along with this journey, a way to meet that yourself if you haven't given birth in another way. So we wanted to get a little feedback from you guys, if that sounds interesting, or there's ideas you have.
Do you want more?
Absolutely.